Thanks for joining us for the third installment in the Backyard Wildlife series, in which we explore the extraordinary stories of our ordinary backyard neighbors. This episode focuses on maybe one of the most iconic birds of North America, the American robin. Probably one of the first birds that we learned to identify, intentionally or not. But before we get started, I do want to take a moment to give a shout out to some of the great work going on by friends and colleagues in the Milwaukee community that are helping to provide connections to the natural world during stay at home. Starting with the Urban Ecology Center's own Chad Tomac, who has a series of short videos called Chad the Nature Dad, in which he explores local green spaces with his adorable daughter Kendall, and adorable and extremely smart daughter Kendall. I just watched the latest episode where they rescue a little meadow vole that was out exposed in a nearby parking lot. There's also some great work again from our friends over at Schlitz Audubon and their Nature from Home campaign. They've got a fun mix of nature-based activities and videos, and you can check on Emerson, their snapping turtle, through a live turtle cam. How cool is that? And finally, in times like these, it's good to be able to process our emotions with others, and I've been able to do that remotely by reading Eddie Daniels' blog, The Natural Realm, which is an excellent photo journal you can find if you go to awealthofnature.org. I encourage you to check it out. I just love Eddie. He writes and photographs with so much intention and warmth. So anyway, back to our robin. In each episode, we start by looking at the phylogenetic grouping of the focus organism according to the system of binomial nomenclature put in place by Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s. Phylogeny, by the way, you heard that term, it looks at the evolutionary histories of organisms and is the basis for grouping organisms along an evolutionary tree. You've probably seen those before, similar to how genealogy is related to studying your family tree. Groups of organisms that are related are on similar branches. So we start at the top with the biggest grouping and then move through each of the smaller groupings. For a little more detail on these larger groupings, you can check out the beginning of the episode 1, Desperate House Sparrows. But robins are animals with backbones, and they are birds. And I didn't really go into what makes a bird like I did with mammals. But I mean, just know that birds are the only animal group with feathers. So for all intents and purposes, that works just fine. You can go further and say that they're warm-blooded and they have a very high metabolism and a 4-chambered heart. In fact, the temperature for most birds is around 104 degrees. And they have a bill, of course, with no teeth, although sometimes the bills are quite serrated or sharp or pointy, like our great blue heron. The largest order of birds are the passeriforms, or perching birds, or songbirds, and then here we take a different pathway than we did with the house sparrows. The robins are the largest local member of the thrush family, also known as Turdidae. From here we go into the binomial nomenclature of Turdus migratorius. I have a bet going on with Tori whether I can get through this without giggling, but let's start with the genus Turdus, which of course is the Latin word for thrush. And then migratorius is Latin for wanderer. And if you look at the common name, American obviously refers to its native range in the New World versus the Old World of Europe and Asia. But what about robin? Why robin? Why is it called robin? And interesting, there's a couple of ways you can explain that. The easy description is that the European settlers named this bird the robin because they thought it looked like the robin back in the Old World of Europe. And I mean, I guess it kind of looks like it. But the European robin belongs to an entirely different family and is actually an Old World flycatcher. But still, why robin? Well, it turns out robin is a diminutive for Robert and is basically the pet name that the English conferred on this bird. Regardless, some of my favorite people are also named Robin, so excellent choice. And robins can be described as large, plump-looking birds with relatively long legs and long tails. They have straight, direct flight patterns. The bird you see here is an adult male, and it can be a little difficult to tell apart male and female robins. Males tend to have darker heads and more of a contrast between that black you see on the head and the kind of gray on the back. If we look at the female during the breeding season, you can see they look fairly similar to the males, just a little bit more muted and maybe a little less contrast between the head and the back. The juvenile bird seen here can really throw people for a loop. It looks like a robin, but kind of not. You've probably seen them, maybe like a robin that caught the measles or something. But one of the more salient characteristics of birds in general is that many of them begin their day by singing, and because there are usually many different bird species in an area, there are often several species singing together in what is known as the dawn chorus. Beautiful aspect of the dawn chorus to me is that not all birds are singing at the same time. Some start earlier, some start later, some sing for a longer time, some sing for a shorter time. Usually starts with one bird, and then maybe another bird joins either the same species or a different species. And a few minutes later, another voice enters the mix, and maybe one of the earlier voices drop out. So species are kind of entering and leaving, singing at different intervals with different tones, different patterns, different tonal qualities. And it's always different from the last dawn chorus you heard, even yesterday. So it's like listening to a symphony where the violins are joined by the flutes and the cellos, and then the violins drop out, and the bassoon does a solo. And so listening for the dawn chorus is one of my favorite parts of traveling in particular, especially camping. You're snuggled in your warm sleeping bag and you can really pay attention. And another really cool aspect of the dawn chorus is that it changes depending on the time of year in addition to the location. So I tend to be an early riser, so I'm usually listening to it by myself and really appreciating it and reflecting on other parts of my life. And of course, you don't have to go camping to enjoy this. You can often hear birds right outside your window, and even better if you like your bedroom a little cooler, you can crack open your window a little bit. But the reason I start here is that the American robin, especially this time of year, starts their bird song crazy early in the morning. Just recently, I started a movie way later than I should have. I turned it off at, I think it was close to 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm putting my head down in the pillow and already hearing the robin singing outside. Easily by 4:30, there's a good chance you'll hear a robin during the breeding season, which is now. So I'm gonna play an audio clip. Sit back and close your eyes if you want to. Imagine it's dark outside and you're just waking up. And we'll introduce you to the lovely, some might say ethereal voice of the American robin. Let's see if I can get this. That recording obviously doesn't do justice to the quality of the robin morning song. And one of the defining characteristics of the robin song stems from an interesting physiological mechanism of birds and their vocal structures. So first, to understand how mammals, including humans, make sound, we start with the larynx, which includes our vocal cords, situated along the trachea in between the lungs and the mouth. If we breathe silently, the vocal cords are relaxed. But if we want to turn breath into sound, we engage the vocal cord muscles. So if you switch between kind of a silent exhalation and your voice, you can kind of feel the vocal cords engaging, which often manifests itself as a laugh. But you can try this with me. Try this. Nobody can hear you. Don't worry. Try to have, well, except for whoever you're in the room with, but try to kind of have a controlled engaging and disengaging of your vocal cords, which will sound kind of like a controlled laugh. So it's kind of something like that, and try to really feel like what it feels like to engage your vocal cords. You're tensing muscles and you're producing sound. But all birds have a very different vocal structure called the syrinx, and you'll see that the syrinx is it's situated much further down at the spot where the two lungs kind of unite into the trachea. And this picture shows that there are actually two sets of vocal cords, one for each lung, and each one can be controlled independently, which ultimately means each lung can produce a different sound at the same time. So a bird can essentially duet with itself. I describe the robin song as kind of ethereal, and if you've ever heard a wood thrush or Swainson's thrush or hermit thrush, those are birds that produce these really hauntingly beautiful sounds because they essentially can duet with themselves. The robin to me sounds more like the richness and quality you get when you have two people with very similar voices singing the same melody. Sometimes like those Bulgarian choruses or the Eastern European choruses. So they're singing the same melody with very similar voices rather than harmonizing, or even if you like record a track and then you record yourself singing the same song on that track, the song begins to sound more robust and full. And to me, it seems like that's what the robin is using those two vocal cords for. It's singing the same song with both sets of chords to create this really rich sound. And you don't always hear it that well, but every once in a while, a robin just blows me away with how clear and full that sound is. I bet that if you asked everyone you knew to name as many birds as they can, the robin would be one of the very first ones for just about everyone, whether they know lots of birds or not. And another iconic sort of robin image we've all probably seen, either in real life or in a photo or depicted in art or a cartoon, is a robin pulling a worm out of the ground. And in fact, worms are a big part of the robin diet, especially in the morning and especially during the breeding season. So look at them next time you see them on a lawn. You often see them running or hopping in these short, rapid stints and then freezing with their head tilted slightly. And they're really looking for movement of their invertebrate prey. If they do see a worm move, they'll grab it and pull. And most of the force comes from their legs, just like your doctor says it's the best way to lift things. Worms can do a pretty good job of not coming out of holes, so the robin does need a good deal of force. But if you kind of combine this image with the sounds we heard earlier, you probably know where the phrase "the early bird gets the worm" from. At least in these parts, they're talking about the robin. And interestingly, the worm is their early in the day food, because in the afternoon they often shift to a diet of fruits and berries. Which brings up another characteristic of the robin, which is their ability to adapt, particularly to human landscapes. If you think about it, neither mowed lawns nor earthworms were here before European settlements. And if we had earthworms here naturally, they would have been destroyed with glaciation. And there's no evidence that worms arrived here before Europeans. So within a couple hundred years, our urban robins adapted to hunt a new food source in a new habitat. There are downsides to this because humans use a lot of pesticides on their lawns, so robins are very susceptible to chemical poisoning. If you are currently using pesticides or even fertilizers on your lawn, I would strongly encourage you to reconsider that practice. In fact, I would challenge all of us to reconsider even having a lawn, but we can talk about that some other time. There's so many cool stories and behaviors in robins. This really could and should be a two-part series. I was thinking of leaving a cliffhanger at the end of one episode, like they do on some sitcoms, like when Fonzie was jumping over the shark enclosure on his water skis, for those of you that remember that show. And then you just have to watch next week to see what happens. But I won't give you the spoiler, but I decided to just crank it all out in hopefully this little less than an hour and get as much as I can in. The next
we have a question. Is there a small hole left in the ground where they have pulled out a worm? We have been noticing some tiny holes in our garden, and I am just wondering.
Ooh, that's a good question. And the answer is probably yes. And also, if worms usually come out at night, usually, and depending on the species of worms, you know, that's maybe one of the reasons why the robins want to get down so early, is to get them before they go back down. But a worm that comes out of a hole and goes back on its own will also leave a hole. So it probably means you have worms if those are wormholes. There's probably other things that would leave holes in your lawn too, but most likely worms. But it doesn't necessarily mean that a robin got them. It means that oftentimes the birds will use the same hole. But look for worm poop. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Around those holes, that would be an indication of whether those are wormholes or not. So. All right. So again, the next thing we're going to tackle here is robin migration. It's both elegantly simple and this tremendously dynamic enigma. So what do we know? Robins leave for the winter, and then their return is a harbinger of spring, right? We celebrate when we see them come back because it means spring is here. And I think that's what most of us are told, at least. And because of that, it's why one of the most common questions I get, either on a phone message or just in person, is hey, Tim, I just looked out in my backyard and I saw a robin. It's December. There's snow on the ground. So it must not have been able to migrate. How can I help it? And the easiest way I can answer that is to pull out this distribution map of the robin. And as you can see, there's 3 color shades in this map. I'm really bad with colors, but I think that light blue indicates the areas where robins can only be found in the winter. The orangish reddish area indicates areas where robins are found only during the summer. And that purpley shade, which includes most of Wisconsin, indicates areas where robins are found all year long. So what? Robins are supposed to be here in December and January? And the answer is yes. Robins are supposed to be here year-round, but there is much evidence that their range has expanded quite a bit, even over just the past couple decades. So what you might remember about robins as a kid might be and probably is quite different than the current reality today. Data suggests there are a couple of factors that have allowed robins to stay farther north in the winter months. One, of course, is a changing climate, and the second likely factor is humans. Humans like color in their yard in the winter, and so we tend to plant shrubs with colorful berries, both native and non-native species, and we're keeping bird feeders up in the winter. So essentially we're likely encouraging robins that might not stick around all winter now. In fact, over the past decade, every single state except Hawaii and every single Canadian province has records of American robins during the month of January. But humans aren't the only reason. Otherwise, pretty much every bird that would stick around all winter. The other piece of the puzzle lies in this very unique nature of American robin migration. Robins are partial facultative migrants. So that's all you need to tell your friends to really impress them. Just memorize those words. Partial facultative migrants. But what does that mean? Well, there are a lot of different ways that we characterize bird migration, and they're not, boxes apart from each other. They're more like Venn diagrams, so you can fit in more than one category. But let's take a quick look at how we categorize some of the categories of bird migration, excuse me. So some birds migrate, and we, of course, call them migrants, like these beautiful sandhill cranes. Some birds don't migrate, and they're called year-round residents, like this black-capped chickadee. Some birds are long-distance migrants, like this bobolink, and bobolinks have two major contributions to their cool factor. The first is that they migrate about 13,000 miles every year, and the second is they sound just like R2-D2. Google it if you haven't heard it. It's so much fun. Some birds are short distance migrants, like this American goldfinch. And you might be thinking, wait a second, I see goldfinches all year round. Why aren't they year-round residents? The cool thing about goldfinches related to where we live is that, yes, they can be seen here year-round, but because they are short distance migrants, we don't see the same individuals here year-round. The birds that we see in the winter migrate north for the summer, and they're replaced by the birds that winter farther south and then migrate here for the summer. So we don't really notice this migration pattern because, I mean, to us, we just see goldfinches year-round, but they're not the same individuals, and they are migrating. Some birds are summer residents because they migrate here to breed in the summer, like the Baltimore oriole we were just talking about. And some birds are winter residents that are here during the cold winter months that migrate north to breed, like this dark-eyed junco. And those to me are one of my favorite birds, maybe them and the year-round residents, because like I gotta get through this winter. You're gonna help me get through it too. We're stuck together. Many bird species are complete migrants, and that means all of the individual birds in the population will migrate or not migrate, like the stunning evening grosbeak, which you can see if you head to northern Wisconsin in January and do winter birding in northern Wisconsin is absolutely one of my favorites. But again, so complete migrants meaning all the birds will migrate or not migrate. That doesn't necessarily mean they all migrate every year or they all don't migrate every year, but they all do it together. And some birds are partial migrants, meaning some individuals in a population will stay in a location year-round and some will migrate, like Canada geese. Then another kind of major category is some birds are obligate migrants, meaning migrating or not migrating is hardwired into their DNA. You're either born a migrant and you're going to migrate every year, or you're born to not migrate and you're not going to migrate every year. And that can be all the birds in a population, or it can be some of the birds in a population. But for an individual, you're going to do what your genes tell you, regardless of what's happening in the world. And then finally, some birds are facultative migrants, meaning individual birds will migrate some years and not migrate other years. It's not hardwired in their DNA. And even when they do migrate, they may migrate a shorter or longer distance than they did the previous year. And this is usually determined by local weather conditions. So essentially, a killdeer, for example, might show up in January if we have a really warm spell. But then if it's followed by a cold spell in February or even later in January, they might say, I'm going to head back down south for a little while. So in other words, they'll only migrate as far as they have to, which is often always based on weather patterns. And this, of course, really only makes sense for short distance migrants. If our bobolink from earlier came too earlier and decided, no, it's too cold here, it can't really, they'd be stuck. So for them, you never really see facultative migrants and migration and long distance migrants. So labeling a robin a partial facultative migrant obviously makes their migration pattern about as clear as mud. And maybe the best way to describe this is to say Yeah, sometimes some of the individuals decide to migrate, maybe, or not. But our perceptions that robins disappear during the winter is rooted in another behavior of the robin, which is roosting. And roosting is a behavior in which birds essentially gather together, usually during the night, to sleep. Oftentimes there's a lot of information sharing in a roost. And some birds, it's hey, this area I went to was really successful. However they communicate that, sometimes they can, like an osprey, they can actually see birds coming back with a full belly, or if it's stored in their gullet to feed their kids, then they can actually, birds will say, oh, that bird was successful in fishing and it came from that direction, so I'm going to head out there in that direction next time. There's a lot of evidence for that. So roosting, or any time birds congregate together, it's usually for defense, because there's a lot of eyes in the group to look out for predators. And oftentimes it's to huddle together for warmth. And then again, there's often a lot of information sharing happening at the roost.
We have a question. Someone asked, so they don't necessarily migrate to follow the food? Question mark.
Food availability is the primary driver in migration. And again, migration is complex. And so the answer still is yes, that food is driving the migration, but food is also very dependent on things like weather. I guess the secondary thing is that yes, sometimes physiological conditions secondarily. I think food is the primary evolutionary driver of migration. And so migration is dangerous. And so if you don't have to migrate because the food is there, then you shouldn't migrate, unless the secondary part of weather is like, yes, sometimes because you do migrate or not, sometimes weather can kill you or take your food away. I remember a really sad case of killdeer that did come early, and then we got a cold spell, and it like caught them off guard. It caught all of us off guard, and I think the story was they were huddled around like a pipe that was probably connected to a building that was letting out some heat, and they were all huddled around that pipe, and sadly they all froze to death. But I would say food is the primary driver, but there are other conditions that will affect migration, and it's a gamble. I mean, if there's a real advantage to being the first bird back during migration, from a standpoint of defending territory is like a home field advantage, but you're taking a risk. If you get here too early, if you get here just right, and you're ready to go, then you have a lot of advantages. But if you get here too early and you take that risk and you maybe get caught in a bad storm, or your food's gone, or one of the issues with climate change is that your food might not be tracking your migration pattern, so you might get to a place before your food is there, and your food might be in a different pattern. So I still think food is the primary evolutionary driver of migration, but there's a lot of other factors involved. That's a really, really good question. So winter roosts, which again, the birds will roost for warmth, for defense, and for information sharing. Winter roosts can be absolutely enormous in robins. There's anecdotal evidence of wintertime robin roosts of more than 250,000 birds, 250,000 birds, which is just insane. Around here, I've never seen groups even remotely that big. But what I do usually notice is I'll go a week or two in January without seeing any robins. And then one day I'll walk through the same area and there's a group of 200 or more robins. So it's the the dynamics of roosting is pretty interesting. During the breeding season, females leave, they leave the roosts because they're sleeping in their nests. They're sleeping in the nest with their eggs or their young. But males during that time are still sleeping in roosts, even though they're bringing food to the young. They're still, kicked out into the couch in the living room with all the other males at that time. So the males are still using the roosts in the breeding season. As young birds gain independence, then they start to join the males in the roosts. And then once the females are done nesting, they go back to the roosts. So this is another maybe contributor to this idea that robins are gone in the winter, is that a lot of times you just, even, though some of them do migrate, so there are fewer birds, but oftentimes you just don't see them as much because they're in these roosts, and the roosts are kind of more hit or miss and what they do when they're leaving the roost and where they're feeding. So there is that pattern of seeing many fewer robins in the winter. Yeah, the roosts themselves are cyclical, and it's just, yeah, my brain just explodes with all of this complexity in robins. And many of you are probably quite familiar with this site, these emblematic baby blue robin eggs, one of the few eggs I can easily identify. And robins build these nests in very familiar places: eaves of your house, security lights, gutters. Barb Kellerman just sent me a picture of a robin nest that's under one of the aluminum canoes in the canoe rack at Washington Park. We've at the Riverside Park branch, there's been some robins that nest just outside of the doors, so you can kind of watch the nest from the inside of the building. They're very good at nesting around houses. And the nest building process is also pretty cool. They build the nest from the inside out. So they start with the inner layer of kind of the soft grasses and the other vegetation, and they use their wing to support the outside as they kind of shape that mold with their bill. So their bill against the beak, and then the beak just provides a really nice kind of back support to push and kind of shape that. And then they build an outer support ring of mud, but now they don't use just any mud. Robins show a preference to use this type of mud, which we talked about earlier. Some of you may recognize this. It's earthworm castings or worm scat or worm poop. If you've ever been out with the great naturalist David Stokes, you've probably heard him repeat the chant song, I don't know what you call it. Robin and Tori, you know this better than me, but it starts with an S, it ends with a T, it comes out of you and it comes out of me. We could call it this and we could call it that, but we'll be scientific and we'll call it scat. So if you ever notice these, like, I don't know, they kind of look like rice puffs or cocoa puffs. If whoever asked that question about worm holes, like, you can kind of see the wormhole. If you see these like little bubbles of dirt on the ground, gently push them away. Totally safe to touch it. Gently push it away, and you'll often see the hole. You may even be able to see the hole in this photo. I'm not sure if that's it, kind of towards the bottom. But so this says, yes, the early bird gets the worm and the worm poop, and it uses that worm poop to primarily to build that kind of outer structure of a robin nest. So think about that next time you see it. They will use other soft muds, but they do show a preference for using worm casting mud. And then once they put that mud layer on the outside of the nest, they put a final support layer of sticks and twigs around the outside, and so you have this very nice nest to raise your babies in. Some interesting and sobering stats about robins. So they'll raise 3 broods per year. They raise a lot of young robins, and that's pretty rare to have so many broods. But you'll see why. They start very early, and they go very late in the breeding season, which you have to do to produce 3 broods. but it's shocking to me that about 40% of the nests will successfully produce any young, and then only 25% of the birds that do successfully fledge will survive to their first November, according to the Cornell website. So after their first year, they have about a 50% survival rate for every subsequent year. And so robins can live a long time, up to 13 years, but chances are pretty unlikely that that'll happen. And an entire population turns over about every 6 years. So if you kind of think of that in terms of like a football team, you know, players come and go, they're signed, they're dropped, they're traded. So it'd be like you win a championship one year, and then 6 years later you win a championship again, but that second championship team is entirely new players. Because that's what an entire population turnover would be, about every 6 years. All right. If a couple of final thoughts here. So if you'll notice some similarities between the American robin and the house sparrow that we talked about in the first episode, and in that both of these birds have been extremely successful in adapting to human landscapes, which is why they're, you know, maybe the first two birds featured in this Wildlife in Your Backyard series. But there is a major difference. House sparrows, you'll only find them near human habitation, farms, houses. And if you go into a forest, it's very unlikely that you'll see house sparrows. They're not successful in breeding in forests. I don't even know if they try. But robins, on the other hand, you can find wild robins in the wilderness of Alaska. You can find them in remote mountain forests, and it's a little bit weird when you do, because you're like, oh gosh, I'm so far away from the city. I'm so, you know, so isolated here. And then a robin pops up, and it's like, whoa, that's not what I was expecting. But they will nest in mature hardwood forests, and essentially this was their habitat before urbanization of the world, and they continue to use those forests while also having adapted to human landscapes. So that's where they really differ from the house sparrows. And you may have heard about bird mnemonics, where people hear a bird call and then we put it to our own language. So it's why the chickadee says chickadee-dee-dee as part of its call, or hey sweetie as part of its song, or cheeseburger. And one of the fun things about working with a lot of you guys is when you make up your own songs and calls. And you're hearing me switch between songs and calls. Songs and calls are different in structure. A lot of birds have both a call and a song, and they usually have different contexts. So calls are usually between family members, between mates, saying, hey kids, where are you? I'm here. Just this little, they're simpler vocalizations. They tend to be simpler vocalizations. And then a song is usually used to either attract a mate or to tell another male, usually it's males that are singing. So let's say it's usually a male telling another male, hey, this is my territory, please leave. And essentially that's when I talked about that morning song earlier. A big part of that morning song is just kind of checking in on your neighbors often. It's a little bit, you're using songs, you still are trying to attract mates and tell your neighbors where you are, and they're listening too, because if they're used to hearing you know, neighbor Bob over in that part of the forest every day, but then all of a sudden they don't hear him, that means maybe something happened to Bob, and for a bird that might be an opportunity to expand their territory or to get another mating in. And so a lot of that morning song is just checking in. Is everybody where they're supposed to be? Yes. Is there somebody that's way too close that I might need to say, hey, you're too close? So it's just kind of like a little bit of a social check-in. between songs and calls. A really excellent resource on this is Donald Kreutzma, The Singing Life of Birds. I recommend that. So anyway, the chickadee says those things. The barred owl says, "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" The American goldfinch says, "Potato chip." Or, of course, if you're Robin Squire, it says recidivist. And one of the questions I get I get often about identification, because we only hear them for a certain stretch of the year, the white-crowned sparrows, and they say, "More cheese, cheese, please, please." Very buzzy. But the mnemonic for the American robin is cheer up, cheerily, cheer up, cheerily. So for me, this mnemonic matches the cheerfulness of the song, the warmth of the robin's bright orange breast, and I think all of these factors contribute to the American robin being the state bird of 3 different states: Wisconsin, of course, and Michigan and Connecticut, and it's why this has become such an iconic bird for our culture. So thank you for listening to these stories today. Again, there's a lot of stories that I didn't think we'd have time for, and we really didn't. So maybe there will be a part 2 sometime, or not. But it's just such a cool bird. One of the quotes I had earlier is that we tend to love what's rare and despise what's so common. But I mean, the robin is just, you kind of forget that they're there, and when you remember that they're there, there's a lot of beauty and just wonder in looking at your robins. And I do, again, just want to remind everybody that we're going to be rolling out a research in your backyard program, and so if you're interested in participating in that, it's a good time to just kind of see what's going on in your backyards. But thank you for listening to me and for these stories today.